Robert E. Lee, Gallant Christian Soldier by Lee Roddy. Chapter 6, A Sword for Virginia. Lee's military buddy, P.G.T. Beauregard, was commander of the Confederate States of America's batteries in South Carolina. He had ordered the first shot at Fort Sumter. After 2 days of Confederate guns firing on Fort Sumter, the Federal post surrendered. Nobody had been killed on either side, but the American flag had been fired upon. On April 15, 1861, President Lincoln issued a call for states to furnish 75,000 troops to suppress combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed. Okay, what? Northern states and Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas would have to send troops to fight against their friends, relatives, and neighbors if these states stayed in the Union. Virginia's legislative body met secretly on April 17th to discuss what to do. Should Virginia remain in the Union? On April 18th, Lee arose and dressed at Arlington. He shaved, seeing his reflection, a 54-year-old man in wonderful physical condition. Mary watched her husband with admiring eyes. He wore a black mustache as he had when superintendent of West Point. His wavy dark hair was showing some gray, but he was still a very handsome man. 2 messages had been delivered the day before. One asked Lee to call on his old commander again. General Scott obviously had something important to discuss with the colonel. The other note was from Francis P. Blair, Sr., an important man in Washington. Lee mounted and rode down from the rolling hills of Arlington, past the wildflowers beginning to bloom across the Potomac River. The horses' hoofs beat like a drum-like military roll across the bridge. Lee moved along Pennsylvania Avenue to the Blair House, directly across the street from the White House. Blair and Lee had met before. The host was a former editor of the Congressional Globe. Blair came right to the point. He had been to see President Lincoln. There was an indication Lee could become commanding general of the massive new Union Army being raised. Later, Lee reported, "I never intimated to anyone that I desired the command of the United States Army, nor did I ever have a conversation with but one gentleman, Mr. Francis Preston Blair, on the subject, which was at his invitation, and, as I understood, at the instance of President Lincoln. After listening to his remarks, I declined the offer he made me to take command of the army. I could take no part in an invasion of the southern states." Lee's position was clear. He left Blair and went to the State, War, and Navy building. General Scott received Lee with a serious face. Lee told his commander what he had said to Blair. The old soldier shook his head. Scott was obviously deeply moved. "Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life." The huge general, slowed by age, paused, then added, "But I fear it would be so." It was a hard moment for both men. Lee was known to be the general's favorite soldier. They had known each other well from trying days in Mexico. They had been good friends since then, but now the situation erased any possibility of this relationship continuing. Scott is reported to have added, "There are times when every officer in the United States service should fully determine what course he will pursue and frankly declare it." Heaving his bulk out of the chair, the general said, "I suppose you will go with the rest. If you propose to resign, it is better that you should do so at once." Lee understood. If orders came to the United States Army to move against the rebels, it would be Lee's duty to obey. He was part of that U.S. Army. He had signed an oath of allegiance. A third call was made before Lee left the capital. He stopped to see his brother, Smith. stationed with the Navy in Washington. They talked of the problems. Lee thought about his family that had been in Virginia for 8 generations. All around Virginia there were Lee cousins, aunts, uncles. The great plantations had known generations of Lees. The churches had heard the voices of untold Lee family members raising their voices in praise, for they were a God-fearing people. All across Virginia, now fresh with new grass and swelling buds, tombstones marked the final resting places of the Lees. But more importantly, all over the landscape were living relatives who bore the Lee name or were close blood kin. The colonel ended the meeting with his brother, saying he would contact Smith again in a few days. Lee mounted and rode toward home. Arlington House lay squarely in the path of any northern invasion of Virginia. The military man in Lee knew there was no way of defending the family plantation if Lincoln ordered troops across the Potomac. The big question was, would Virginia join the other states in withdrawing from the Union? The people had until May 23rd to decide, but Lee had to make his decision at once. To stay in the U.S. Army and fight his state, his family, his friends, or to resign his commission. The next day brought the necessity for a decision to a head. Lee rode into Alexandria on April 19th. The city was crackling with excitement. Lee watched the waving of banners with his usual quiet reserve. He went into the stable Leadbeater apothecary shop to pay a bill. Someone asked, "Colonel Lee, what do you think of Virginia's decision to secede, subject to the vote of the people on May 23rd?" Lee replied quietly, "I must say that I am one of those dull creatures that cannot see the good of secession." The druggist marked Lee's bill paid, then scrawled Lee's remarks about secession on the corner of the ledger. The colonel walked outside into the warm spring air. The streets of the town where he had grown up were noisier than before. He caught the temper of his fellow Virginians in their loud remarks. "We're going to have to fight, that's for sure," a gray-haired man shouted. "Let the war come." "It won't last long," his son stormed. "That's right," their friend on horseback laughed. "The South'll whip them Yankees before they'd know what happened." "You're right, absolutely right. The war won't last long, a few months at most," the father said. Lee's military experience told him this was impossible. If war came, it would not be brief. It would be long, bloody, and painful. He remembered the Mexican battlefields. War would hurt, and war would personally hurt him, for he had so much to lose. Lee returned to Arlington with a copy of the Alexandria Gazette. He handed it to his wife without saying a word. Mrs. Lee only needed a glance to understand. By a 2-to-1 vote, the Virginia Convention had voted to secede. Ratification by the people was now merely a form. Virginia had made her choice. Now Lee must make his. He told his wife he wanted to be left alone. He climbed the stairs in the mansion. Mrs. Lee could hear her husband pacing upstairs. Far into the dark hours of that warm April evening she heard his measured footfalls. Sometimes he fell to his knees, and Mrs. Lee knew he was praying for divine guidance. Should he resign his command in the U.S. Army he had sworn to uphold against all enemies? From his window on the second floor, Lee could see across the Potomac. He could see the flickering lights which marked the Capitol. It was near midnight when Mrs. Lee heard her husband stop pacing again. But she did not hear his knees on the floor. Instead, a chair scraped faintly as though he had pulled the one away from his desk. Mrs. Lee correctly guessed that her husband was writing letters. Lee had made his decision. It was well after midnight when Lee came downstairs with some letters in his hands. He approached his wife in her wheelchair and handed her the letters without speaking. She read the first one to the Secretary of War. It was brief. Sir, I have the honor to tender resignation of my commission as Colonel of the 1st Regiment of Cavalry. The second letter to General Scott, longtime friend and military comrade, was longer, but it began bluntly, with a tone which indicated how things had changed in a few days. General, Lee wrote, since my interview with you on the 18th inst, I have felt that I ought to retain my commission in the Army. Therefore, tender my resignation, which I request you will recommend for acceptance. Lee added, it would have been presented at once, but for the struggle it cost me to separate myself from service to which I have devoted the best years of my life and all the ability I possessed. Since Lee was 18 years old, he had turned his whole life to the military. Now, on April 20th, 1861, long before dawn, Lee thanked General Scott for his kindness and consideration. Lee said he would remember the rest of his life the good memories of the general. Save in the defense of my native state, Lee concluded, I never desire again to draw my sword. It took a few days for the letter to be officially noted in the War Department. On April 25th, the Secretary of War's signature and the word accepted showed it was final. After 32 years, Lee's service to the U.S. Army had ended. Lee wrote another letter to explain to his brother Smith that he had resigned. I wish I could wait until the ordinance of secession to be acted upon by the people of Virginia, Lee wrote, but war seems to have commenced, and I am liable at any time to be ordered to the duty which I could not conscientiously perform. To save me from such a position and to prevent the necessity of resigning under orders, I had to act at once. He was, Lee concluded, now a private citizen and have no other ambition than to remain at home. Lee's letter to his sister Anne was difficult. Her son was in the U.S. Army and her husband was for the North. To her, Lee exclaimed his resignation. I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. He said that, save in defense of my native state, with the sincerest hope that my poor services may never be needed, I hope I may never be called on to draw my sword. That Saturday morning, the Alexandria Gazette had an editorial about Lee. It is probable that the secession of Virginia will cause an immediate resignation of many officers of the Army and Navy from this state. We do not know, and have no right to speak for or anticipate the course of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Whatever he may do will be conscientious and honorable. But the newspaper continued, if Lee did resign, there is no man more worthy to head our forces and lead our army. The editorial gave further praise to Lee as a soldier in whom the people of Virginia had confidence, noting his Christian life and conduct make his name a tower of strength. Mrs. Lee wrote to a friend, my husband has wept tears of blood over this terrible war, but as a man of honor and a Virginian, he must follow the destiny of his state. Lee went to Christ Church in Alexandria the next day, where 3 strangers talked to him in the courtyard. The governor was summoning Lee to a meeting. On Monday, Lee left Arlington for the last time in his life and headed for Richmond, capital of Virginia.